Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1243 of the Locked on Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Thursday evening into Friday. Thank you for joining us, as always, on this podcast and subscribing to the show across podcast platforms. If you missed it by the title or anything else, this is actually part two that you're about to watch or listen to between myself and Andrew Kelly talking about fake trades for the Hawks and some team building exercises, etc. So if you missed it, part one is where you should start on this conversation. It should be available in your podcast feed right now. Check that out if you have not done that already. Beyond that, no further intro needed. Andrew and I had a lot of fun talking about some of the more prominent potential targets for the Hawks on the market in the next couple of weeks, and we'll have more of that coming up in a moment.
You are Locked on Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
I know that they want to keep Mitchell probably more than Gobert at this point in time. I'm not actually going to Donovan now because he's the probably the other prominent guy we talk about more than anybody else. In fact, Andrew, I think he might be the player in the entire NBA that we've discussed the most behind the scenes in the other than Hawks players, I should say, that we discussed more. Would you agree? I'm not sure if there's another guy in the league that you and I and Glenn and other people have talked about more behind the scenes than Donovan Mitchell for like the last 2 years.
Yeah, it seems like it. I think that we've just all kind of sensed that it's pretty likely he becomes available at some point, and he's very good. So he just kind of consistently comes up in our private discussions. But yeah, it's funny. I remember when we first started talking about this, like in 2019, 2020, and now it's like, I mean, he might be available now. Yeah, but yeah, he definitely does seem like that guy.
Yeah, I think he's gonna. I mean, we don't know. Mitchell, it seems like, and you might disagree, it seems like he'll not be traded unless he wants to be this offseason. I think that the owner in the new owner with Utah likes him, and he's their guy. I think they definitely value him more than Rudy at this point in time. But he also might want out, and that might happen. There's been rumblings that might happen. Him and Rudy famously don't get along all that well, so we'll see. But let's just say, for our purposes on this podcast, let's just say hypothetically he's available. There's more nuance than this for sure. But sort of there's two camps that I feel that I see, and you can sort of draw your conclusions on where we are. But there's you go out anytime you get a player like Donovan Mitchell, you trade for him camp, which I think I'm kind of in, but not quite maybe the level that I think that you might be. And then there's the level, then there's the more team building level where like, a team with Trae Young and Donovan Mitchell together is not the perfect fit by any means. And defensively, you're kind of just asking for trouble with those two guys. Obviously, there are points along the spectrum that incorporate both viewpoints, and I think I have one of those points. But I wonder what you think about Mitchell, both as like a hypothetical target and whether like what you want to pay, like whether you'd be really interested in him, because like realistically he could be available. And if that happens, he's got the Adidas connections with Trae and even with John Collins, et cetera. There's some pretty interesting ties there.
This is funny because we've talked about him so much in private that you have to ask me my opinion on Mitchell for the public.
I did say in there. I think I know where you stand, but I want to make sure people understand. In public between the two of us.
I'm a big fan of Mitchell, and I think he's also another guy that's probably underrated now, just because he's had a very disappointing playoff exit, but he's had some incredible playoff performances. I mean, when you talk about Mitchell, I mean, this is a guard that is a Team USA guy, an All-NBA guy, locked up under team control for like his super prime years. I mean, this is a guy that I think you have to be interested in. He's a type of player where I think that talent supersedes fit. That's not true in all cases, but when it comes down to like closer to cream of the crop level talent, which is what I view Mitchell as, then that's the kind of guy where you prioritize, like, let's get him in, let's see how we can build around him, even if the fit isn't great on paper. But with Mitchell, you mentioned the Adidas connections. That's something that I think people underrate. The sneaker stuff does matter. So that's an angle too. He's friends with Trae off the court. I think that there's other considerations too. Like if Mitchell comes to the Hawks, he's not coming to be the number 2 to Trae. He's coming to be the co-number 1.
1B.
Hierarchy is a very important thing in the NBA. It's, if he comes to Trae's team, he's not going to perceive himself as being a number 2. So you have to sort of value him from a front office perspective as you do Trae and sell him on that. So I think that's an important thing to discuss too with Mitchell. But when you talk about like what I'm getting back to about needing another creator, just running out of ideas offensively in the playoffs like they did against Miami. I mean, with Mitchell, you cannot put 2 on Trae. Like you can't do that, because if he's on the court, he will kill you in those 4-on-3 situations. And another thing too is, I think it's really important to be able to stagger your stars if you have them. So you could run lineups with, Mitchell with Trey on the bench and vice versa. That's a big luxury to have. When you have Donovan Mitchell like leading a bench unit without Trey, like that's an important thing to have versus like DeLon Wright leading a bench unit, or someone like that. Like it's a huge.
Easy there, sir.
Yeah, no DeLon Wright slander, but I'm just saying. I'm just saying. But yeah, you add that level of a shot creator, someone that you can stagger with Trey, someone that I think could reduce the fatigue that Trey accumulates throughout the season. He's also someone that I think is good enough and has the pedigree that Trey is willing to defer to at times. Like if Mitchell's hot, I think that Trey may not take some of the shots that he does if, he needs to lean on Mitchell in a particular game. I think he's someone that Trey could convince himself, hey, let me try and run off a screen or do things like that off ball that he might not be willing to do for like a Herder type. He's a different level of player, and he brings different gravity to the table than the current members of the Hawks roster. So again, I think defensively, like, it's not good. Like that's the best way to portray it. I mean, you're essentially punting on point of attack defense between Trey and Donovan Mitchell. So then, maybe they can get Gobert in the trade too.
Well, I was gonna say it would honestly look a lot like Utah did.
Yeah.
Except for maybe
the high end talent is definitely different from
obviously you
Utah.
You have more offensive talent than Utah had.
You've got to have a center like a Conley who can come out and defend on the perimeter. You've got to have good perimeter defenders who know team defense concepts and are able to help and things like that. So it definitely does put a lot of stress on your roster building as far as finding like the defensive pieces you need to make that core work. But at the end of the day, I mean, I do kind of come back to like Daryl Morey's philosophy of just like get Team USA players if you can. If you get Donovan Mitchell, he's interested in going to your team. The Hawks have never really been like a free agent destination or anything like that. If you have him who's interested in coming there, I think you got to do it.
Yeah, and I get that viewpoint. I'm not quite as like definite about it as you are, but even as someone who I am not as high on Mitchell as some, but even I think he's a top 25, 30 guy in the league. Like he's a really good player, and I think that he is potentially the best guy you can get, and that the fit is not going to be good. It will probably have me pulling my hair out if that happens in terms of watching them try to defend, but offensively they would be absolutely terrifying. I mean, we saw how good the Hawks were in the regular season this year with Trey and a bunch of guys we talked about before. Like they have some decent offensive talent on this roster, obviously, but preseason favorite to be the best offense in the league by a pretty decent margin. If you have Trey and Donovan on the same team, like it might be the closest thing that they could think of recently is like what the Nets probably would have been if they had ever been together for very long, in terms of just being able to score at will. And obviously those Nets teams had KD, who was a more capable defender on them. But like, it's an interesting thought exercise that we'll probably save some of for the future. But I think that if Mitchell both asks out and is actually available, and B wants to come to Atlanta, there's certainly a deal or two that I would make to get him. I think that my breaking point on doing it is probably lower than yours, knowing how where we both stand. But at the same time, like if it's available to you, I do understand the thought process of going out and getting him, because he is a premium talent. And, frankly, the Hawks may not be able to have that guy fall in their lap again, because as much as we talked about this, but, both online, offline, us, everybody else talking about this, like the second star, like, yeah, it'd be great if it was a wing that was a two-way wing, but those guys aren't coming available all the time. Like you might have to just quote unquote settle for someone like Donovan Mitchell, who is really good and has really big flaws. And maybe you're just hoping and praying that he gets back to his Louisville days defensively when he's not the number one offensive player. And I think that's probably pie in the sky, but I think that it also changes your roster, but like you said as well, like you have to kind of pivot the rest of your roster in a lot of ways to like really be intentional about, like, you can't have any other bad defenders basically. Otherwise, you're just like kind of drawing dead in some respects in the playoffs on defense, especially. But those are rich man's problems too. So he's a really interesting case for me because he has signed long. He has signed long term. It's a 3. I guess he's on a 3+1 now after this season. So like minimum 3 years of control. He's on your timeline on some level. He's older than Trey, but not too much older. I don't know. He'd be interesting for me for sure because like I think he's more of an on-ball guy, but the best case scenario in some ways on offense anyway would be to have a guy who can run your team when Trey sits, and he can obviously do that. Today's show is brought to you by Built Bar, and I absolutely love brownies, but actually, what's even better than brownies? Brownie batter. Sometimes I just eat the batter itself when I'm making the brownies, and if you could just imagine that now, eating it off the spatula and getting that badly needed protein in the process, you're in luck because Built Bar has a new creation. That's one that's actually better than ever. It's the Brownie Batter Puff. You heard me right. The Puff takes protein bars to a whole new level, and they're available right now at Built.com. If you haven't tried the Puffs yet, overall, I don't know what you're waiting for at this point. I've been telling you for a while. It's time to check out the Puffs overall and really everything at Built Bar. With 140 calories, 17 grams of protein, only 7 grams of sugar, Brownie Batter Puffs, I should say, are the perfect pick-me-up for any day. All Built Puffs have 100% real chocolate on the outside. That means with Built, you can actually eat healthy and enjoy doing it in the process. They have collagen protein, which your body can absorb more efficiently, and they have tons of health benefits. The Brownie Batter Puffs will have you completely forgetting that you're actually eating a protein bar. Don't need to pinch yourself. It's actually real life in the way it tastes, and it's also quite healthy in the process. Go to Built.com right now to get Brownie Butter Puffs, and when you get there, use the promo code LOCK15 on your order. If you do that, 15% off on your whole order with Built Bar. Built.com, promo code LOCK15, 15% off at Built.com.
Yep, and one thing too is I think that often fans like underestimate how much you have to pay for these types of players. Like I see a lot of trade proposals. I know you see a lot of trade proposals, and you're not getting these top all NBA players without giving up a lot. Like, you're giving up like multiple picks, 2 to 3 first round players. 2 to 3 first round picks, a couple good young players, things like that. Like I just see a lot of trade proposals where, the Hawks keep most of their roster and get like these star guys. And that just doesn't happen. But again, he's a guy where I just think that the talent ultimately supersedes fit. I mean, at the end of the day, it really does come down to top end talent. Certainly, it places a lot of burden on the rest of the roster construction. You have to be able to find versatile defenders, things like that. They can make it work around them. But at the end of the day, you're just not going to convince me that it's a bad idea to trade for Donovan Mitchell. Like that's just where I stand.
I've been trying for like a year and a half to convince you. No, and not even I, as someone who again is like I care about defense a lot. And I don't think it's the greatest fit in the world. And I'm not like over the moon about Mitchell. And I still think it's like reasonable to go do that. If you can do it at the right price, you kind of just have to on some level. So we'll see if that becomes a thing. Again, there's multiple steps that have to happen before we get there. I think those are the 3 guys that are like the most prominent, like potential. So we spent a lot of time on them. There are other conceivable guys they can obviously go trade for. I'm not going to say any more names. I'm going to turn that over to you for a second. Who's on your list in terms of like potential? You could even tier them up if you want to. Like what's going on in your always rapidly functioning brain on fake trades that are not involving Mitchell, Ayton, or Gobert?
Well, I appreciate the rapidly functioning. I think that I've declined a little bit. I'm 32 now. I don't know how. Well, I think when we talk about targets, I mean, I think on some level you have to discuss Ben Simmons. I mean, just because this is a guy that the Hawks were active in trying to acquire at the deadline. Yep. Of course, Daryl Morey is just one of the worst guys to have to negotiate in the league. He had his eyes only set on Harden. You can argue now whether that was the right process, but he was only set on Harden. So if the Nets were to make Simmons available, maybe they didn't like how the back stuff went down with him. They probably almost certainly expected him to be ready for the playoffs. I can't imagine that they would trade Harden like they did and not expect to get Simmons back for the playoff run if they expected him to be healthy. So if the price were to be reasonable on him, like maybe like a Bogdanovich, like Capella type outline, something like that, I think I would still be interested in Simmons. We've talked about him a lot, so I don't want to spend too much time on him, but one of the best perimeter defenders in the game. Someone that, even if he's not a great scorer, can still take advantage of 4-on-3 type situations that Trey will generate. So he's somebody that I think we have to talk about just briefly. Do you think he's somebody that they might have some interest in if he were to become available again?
Yeah, I'm sure they would on some level. Clearly the back thing is a little weird. I'm not sure if that's like a long-term concern. We don't have the medicals they'd have to have.
From what I understand, it's like a relatively minor procedure. Yeah. I think Woj said he'll be available before training camp.
Yeah, and obviously they would want to see the medicals on that, and I think that there's enough weirdness with Simmons, who has not played in so long, that you got to be pretty confident he can play both mentally and physically at this point. I mean, he hasn't, he obviously had the mental health stuff as well, which I don't, I'm not picking on him for. It's just that's reality. You have to be confident that he can actually play for you if you're going to trade what it takes to get him, and you're the Hawks. But yeah, I think they'd be interested for sure. I mean, they were interested during, as you mentioned, during last trade deadline. They were in the mix, and I think they just kind of figured out that they didn't have what they wanted. And by they, I mean Daryl Morey wanted. So this time around, and if you're the Nets, you might just want to consolidate. You might want to what's the opposite of consolidate? Spread your resources out a little bit more, and maybe not just be tied to the Ben Simmons experience when you already have, presumably you have KD and Kyrie on your team still. you might be better off with, a couple of starters. Where, like you laid out Capella and Bogdanovich, like that's a pretty good return for a guy who hasn't played in almost 2 years.
Yeah, I agree with that, because like the Boston series clearly showed that they have additional holes on their roster. So you could talk yourself into, maybe the top end talent takes a dip, but we're addressing some key areas. So I think that Simmons is just someone that you have to at least touch on, just because he could potentially become available, and he's someone they've shown interest in the past. But whenever we're talking about like as far as like trade targets, and this is like lower on like the realism scale, but when people ask me like, if you could pick anybody, who do you think you'd like to have that might, conceivably be available? It'd probably be like Shai Alexander of Oklahoma City.
Let's do it.
I think that's like the guy that if I could pair like one guy with Trey, he'd be probably top of the list, just because he has a size that Mitchell doesn't have, so it's easier to make that pairing work. He's a better defender than Mitchell is. I think Mitchell is better in the vacuum, but as far as like fit with Trey, I do prefer Shai there, and he's an elite driver. Just the ability to have that kind of driving, playing off of Trey, I think is just tantalizing. So if he were to become available for some reason, he has to ask out. They're not going to trade him without that. But we know Sam Presti loves his picks. The Hawks have all their future picks and a couple additional ones. So if he were to become available by some stretch of the imagination, that would be the guy where I just unload the clip. That's who you really try to bring in if you can.
Yeah, he's a name that gets thrown around sometimes, and I think is to your point, like a step down on the no bleeping way scenario from guys that you might want. Like, obviously if you're picking a guy in a lab, it'd be like Jason Tatum, but he's not available, obviously.
Yeah. You have to at least be able to like squint and see how they could do it.
Right.
Like the Celtics aren't trading Jason Tatum.
Right. And that's what I mean. Like maybe you go to like, I think Shai, given that he's in a weird situation with Oklahoma City where like, it's almost like he's been there too long and they're still so far away that maybe they want to move on. And it's so weird to think about him being like almost beyond their timeline, but it's, maybe he is. I have no idea what's going on in Oklahoma City, but I think that he is really interesting. Defensively isn't the best right now, but maybe would get better in a better situation where he wasn't the number one guy, has some tools defensively, has good size. So like, I think he would be certainly, that's a high end target and it requires Oklahoma City playing ball with you, but that's a home run swing. I certainly would agree with you. I mean, I'd rather have Shai than anyone we've talked about so far, just to be clear, in terms of, within reason. If you just assume a reasonable return, I'm not saying he's a better player than those guys. Like, I think Rudy Gobert is better at basketball right now than Shai is, but I think for the Hawks and for the long-term and timeline and all that stuff, I think he'd be the guy I would choose above all of them. I think same thing with Mitchell. I think Mitchell's probably a better player than Shai right now, but I think just in terms of fit and all that stuff, I think I'd rather lean Shai. So sure, sign me up. Today's show is brought to you by BetOnline, and its May baseball season is up and running at full steam at this stage. And of course, the NBA playoffs are still rolling along with a high-level game almost every night of the week. And with that in mind, BetOnline.net is the number one source for all your sports betting needs and information. This year, they have the latest odds, contests, futures, player props, exotics, and much more. And BetOnline is the best spot for all of the developments in the sports world. Trust me, I'm on there all the time, and it's fantastic. BetOnline is not just basketball or baseball either. They have everything across the board in the sports world. And beyond that, they have live betting, they have favorite casino games, they have poker, etc. And they have odds on all kinds of different sports. They have golf, which is big right now with a major going on right now as I speak. Esports, tennis, auto racing, horse racing, hockey playoffs are ongoing. And Stanley Cup is always a fun time to pursue. MMA stuff, boxing, soccer, cricket, entertainment bets, and much more. It's a great time to look at the futures market as well. In the NFL, college football, college basketball, all those future-facing markets are available 24/7, and they're very interesting to sort of weigh and use as a projection tool and a lot of sports stuff as well. BetOnline.net has all of what you need in the sports world, and check it out right now to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts.
Yep, I'm with you on that. And that's probably it as far as guys I have that, are some of the best players in the NBA. And, you can maybe squint and are available like a Gobert, a Mitchell, a Simmons, and Shai. Those are the high-end guys. I mean, Zach LaVine there's probably some whispers, I guess, that he could become available. I think that ultimately the Bulls will just end up paying him. They'll give him the max deal. But
he'd have to want to leave. I mean, that's the thing. He's a free agent, so it's his is almost. It's different than Ayton because the Suns could just match on Ayton, whereas Levine can just leave. But of course, the Hawks don't have cap space, so like he has to choose.
It would have to be a sign and trade.
Yeah. He has to choose the Hawks and then have Chicago play ball with you, which is like that's not the easiest thing in the world.
It's not very likely, but I get asked enough about him that I wanted to at least touch on him. I mean, he's I think that as far as like offensive fits, he's really incredible with Trey because he's so good off the ball. He's proven that he's able to defer to another player like DeMar for long stretches of time. So if you could get Levine, I mean, that's another guy that it's pretty obvious to me that you should get him, but I don't think he'll become available. I just wanted to touch on him.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. Anybody on your list that's like a step or two down from that, like more of a not necessarily a role player, but not a star, not a top 30 guy in the league, not top 40 guy in the league? Is there somebody like that? Because I'll say the one guy I hear the most about, I don't know what it is recently. Maybe there was like a stray like weird report or something like that. Is Malcolm Brogdon? He's from here, which maybe adds to it. He actually played at GAC down the street from where I grew up, and a guy who played under Nate. I'm not sure that he would want to come here because him and Nate famously didn't get along at the end in Indiana. But that's a guy that's been people keep asking me about. I'm not sure if there's anybody else on your list that's like not a star, but might be interesting.
Brogdon, I think, is a great guy to discuss because, like I said, we've already touched on some of the best players in the league with various degrees of realism as far as like ability to acquire. Brogdon, you can get Malcolm Brogdon, in my opinion. If you're willing to match what Indy is willing to take for him, I think you could get him. I don't even think he would cost that much, honestly. He's 30 years old, or entering his 30 years old season. They acquired Halliburton. They could potentially draft a guard with their lottery pick. I think they're fine sitting him out. Even like a Bogdanovich type swap, I think that's something that Indy might take just because I think Bogey's a good fit with young guys, and he has 1 year less on his deal than Brogdon has, I believe. So I think that you already kind of have the outlines of a trade there. You touched on it briefly too, that the relationship with Nate was reportedly pretty sour. Yeah, not great. So we're talking about that from the outset. This is a team that has at times, I think, had some leadership issues. So if you bring in a situation where you might have some tension between a newly acquired player and the coach, like that's already a situation that's sort of a red flag in itself. But as far as on court play, I think that there's a lot to like. Brogdon is the type of guard who can play on ball and off ball, which is really nice to have with a Trae Young team. He's a good shooter. He can also be a good scorer and scale up to high usage when you need that. So I think that's very beneficial to have. He's a fine defender. I think sometimes people like overrate his defense to a degree. Like he's not good at the point of attack. Like he can defend down some, but he's really not great at defending point guard. So I think that could be an issue as far as like defense. But I think that they could acquire him. He's a realistic candidate. I don't think he would cost that much. He's a good fit with Trae. So I think that you should be interested in some level because of that. But I mean, this is a guy who's like famously unreliable physically. Ultimately Milwaukee moved him on because they couldn't trust that he would be healthy in the playoffs. He's never played more than 2,000 minutes in a season. He's entering his 30s. He's still got, I think, 3 or 4 years left on his 3 years left on his deal, I think. Yep. And he's making, about 22 million and as far as like average annual value. So this is like a contract that could not look great if he continues to physically decline. So I think you have to take that into perspective. But I think he is a good fit with Trae and he's a realistic target. So I think I'm not out on him, but I just have my concerns as far as like the McMillan history and the injury history and frankly what he's making too, as far as like, somebody that's not reliable.
Yeah, I have little else to add. I think you covered it there with the fact that he would make a lot of sense. The injury stuff is concerning because he'll be usually as guys get older they don't get healthier. He'll be 30 next year. Was an older guy coming out of college. I think, and also he randomly has not shot well 2 of the last 3 seasons from 3. I'm not sure what you make of that. I think he's a good shooter, but it's been a little bit weird lately.
Yeah, the sample size isn't huge on that either because he's hurt a lot. I feel like over a longer sample, like the shooting is there. And again, I think he's a good guy to discuss because he is a creator. Like they need to add another creator, and he's acquirable, and he's from Atlanta. So I just think that he makes sense on that level. There's just a lot of downsides with him.
Yep. That's a good, it's sort of an aggressive move though, because if it works, it's probably a fairly modest price given where Indiana is in their cycle. They're not going to be able to like put him up for, for auction and get a ton of money a ton of assets back for him right now because of the contract's like fine, but he's not on this great contract. And, they're obviously not necessarily in a full rebuild, but they had a bad season last year and probably want to pivot a little bit for a guy who's 30 years old. I'm not sure if that's bogey or whatever, but he's the matching salary that makes the easiest sense. He would be a guy, by the way, if I was the Hawks, if I was going to do that, I would be trying to get to try to do like a Brogdon for Gallo and 16 kind of thing at the draft. That's
a good one.
That'd be the offer that I would make first.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Just because of Indiana and where they are, maybe they're ready to move on, just kind of get a little bit younger. Obviously, with Gallo, they could just cut him and save that money, get a first round pick, etc. that's obviously it's kind of a sell low move for Indiana. But if you can get a guy who's like a starting caliber player for you for that package as the Hawks, it makes some sense that you can kind of add him in to what you already have. That's pretty interesting because he gives you something that those guys don't give you. So just a thought.
Yeah, I think that's a very good proposal. You know, just
look at
like
that.
Gallo,
Trade,
get
baby.
off. Yeah, I mean, get off the money and get an asset for it. Easy deal.
Well, that's one of those things that goes all the way back to like the luxury tax and spending. But the easiest way for the Hawks to make themselves really good without even taking a huge swing would be to just like have something in that Gallo slot, like trade Gallo for something using the fact that he's non-guaranteed, maybe throw a pick in there, and you become very expensive if you do that. But like that makes your team better. Not that Gallo's terrible, but if you could turn Gallo and one pick into a rotation or maybe even a starting caliber perimeter player, like that's a heck of an ad for not giving up that much, given what Gallo is right now. So
yeah, agreed.
It's an easy move to make if you could take on the money. Anybody else you want to name before we get out of here? I mean, we talked about a lot of guys. You and I probably just do this for 2 hours, but I wonder if there's like any like sleeper guy that we haven't mentioned. If not, that's okay too. I think for the most part we've accomplished what I meant to accomplish here, which is everyone always asks me about all these guys, and now we talked about them at least once.
Well, I think Jerami Grant is somebody that they've kind of been loosely connected with, and he's another guy that's sort of in the Brogdon tier of like this is a good, you know, top 75 type player who might be available for the right price. So he's a realistic guy I think is worth discussing. He's someone that has really changed his game, obviously, since he's moved to Detroit. Like he's a good isolation scorer. He does it probably too much, but he is a good isolation scorer. He's a very good, versatile defender. Honestly, if you were to take this Hawks team the last year and you were to swap DeAndre Hunter for Jerami Grant in the starting lineup, and you assume that you're getting something closer to like Denver, Jerami Grant, like that team is good. You know, this upgrading from like Hunter, he was a replacement level player last year, to Grant, he's like, you know, a top 80, you know, guy in the league. Like that's a pretty big upgrade. But when you think about like how they might acquire him, I think it's more challenging. Like I think Detroit would definitely want someone like Collins to pair with Cade in return for Grant. Or I mean, it can cost less than that, but you know, Collins is definitely a better player than Grant for me. So that's not something I would do. But if you were to view the team as like, hey, our problem is we've got to upgrade our small forward position. So let's see how we can go about addressing that. Like Grant's somebody that could be available and would be an upgrade, you know, like frankly. So I think that he makes sense. Like I said, he's a good isolation scorer. He's a very good defender. He's someone that I think we should at least touch on, but I would have issues with him too. You know, if you were to keep Hunter in the deal, just because both those guys tend to stop the ball at times. Yeah, so I think that could be an issue in offense.
All the reporting about Grant does not want to take a smaller role in offense than he's had in Detroit is a little bit concerning. Not that the Hawks don't need some more shot creation, but he's had all you can eat in Detroit. And if he likes that, I'm not sure that's the greatest thing in the world for you.
Yep. The shot creation is nice to have, but again, like it's tough to play him with Hunter. He doesn't rebound either. So there's that challenge as well. But I think he's still, you know, like I said, if you were to look at it from the scenario of like, let's improve the 3 position, then, you know, Grant makes sense. But otherwise, he's not somebody that would be high on my list, but I did want to at least touch on him.
Yeah, he would be a great another guy. Like if Detroit wants to just kind of lean it a little bit further to the young rebuilding, get some more assets thing, maybe he would be another Gallo plus pick or 2 kind of guy you can go out and get. But I'm with you. The fit's not ever been perfect for me, especially when you factor in what they already have on the roster. He is a lot better than Hunter at this moment in time, but never been my favorite fit in the world. I think he, you know, as a role player, he makes a lot of sense, but I don't think he wants to be that anymore. I think he wants to be a pretty prominent scorer, and not been my favorite role for. Granted, he's been better than I thought he was going to be very honest with you, in Detroit. But I think he still is like not a guy that you want having a ton of usage and not being terribly efficient with it. So I don't know. We could do this all day long. I was happy to hear you say that Collins is better than Grant, though. I was proud of you.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be objective sometimes. You know, I have to recognize that.
No, there's a running joke that Andrew is too low on Collins, which I do. I still stand by, Andrew. But you can't appreciate what Collins does well. So I'm not going to accuse you of being comically too low. At least you have watched. I wish you've watched the Hawks enough to where I do trust your opinion. Whereas the national people that want to tell you things about Collins or Hunter or whoever else that have never watched them play, or that like Kevin Huerter is like the worst defender in the world because he's a white guy who's skinny. It's always funny to me.
Yeah, it's funny too when you see like various deals for like John Collins going to the Mavs, and it's like, all right, like, you know, here's 2 okay role players. Like that'll get the job done.
It's like, yeah, I'm sure the Hawks really want to do that. And listen, I get that a team like Dallas, both for Capella or Collins, really, like I get why they would want to do that, but they don't really have anything to trade for those guys. I mean, unless they're going to trade you Dorian Finney-Smith, and if they're going to do that, then it becomes kind of interesting on some level. But they're not going to do that because the whole point is to add him to their team, not to take away their best perimeter guy, their best perimeter defender, I should say. Anyway. Okay. Well, Andrew, we spent a lot of time. Thank you for giving me so much time over 2 podcasts. If you have anything to plug, feel free. I know if you're watching on YouTube, you can see Andrew's Twitter handle on the screen. But if you're not watching on YouTube, where can they find all of your musings and all your takes, Andrew?
Yeah, nothing to plug really. You can find me on Twitter though. A Kelly, ANDLAN KELL. Happy to engage. Really enjoy making conversation there. But that's where you can find everything that I do.
Check out Andrew. I'm sure he'll be saying something, and we'll talk again in the near future, I'm sure. I try not to bug you too much. You have a life, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, but it's always fun to talk with you on these things. And I promise next time we'll do less fake trades. Maybe we'll talk about an actual real trade when you come back on.
Yeah, hopefully everything's not out of date by then either. You have to restart from the beginning, but
it'll be fine. It's mid-May. We're holding on here, and hopefully, yeah, you're right though. That's always a concern any point of the year. But thanks again.
Appreciate you, man.
Yeah, thanks again to Andrew for all of the time, and please subscribe to this show on Twitter and check us out there as well. YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Follow me, follow Andrew, and we'll see you all next time.